You have sent a message and immediately wished you could take it back, not because what you said was wrong, but because you said it at the wrong temperature. The hurt was real. The reaction was real. But the version of it that came out, the sharpness, the certainty, the things you said that you wouldn't have chosen if you'd had 10 more minutes, that version created a problem that the original feeling didn't require. You have lain awake replaying something that ended hours ago, not to understand it. You understood it by the second replay. You kept going because something in you could not let it rest, could not accept that the conversation had happened the way it happened. Kept looking for the version where you said exactly the right thing, or where they finally understood, or where it resolved cleanly, instead of just stopping. You have felt someone else's bad mood land on you like weather. They walked into the room carrying something, and within minutes, you were carrying it too. You didn't choose to absorb it. You just did. And then spent the rest of the day trying to figure out if you were the cause of it, if you could fix it, if their emotional state somehow said something about you. You have apologized for things that were not your fault, not because you believed you were wrong, because the tension of someone else's discomfort became more unbearable than the quiet injustice of taking responsibility you didn't owe. These are not character flaws. They are not evidence of weakness. They are the default settings of a person who was never taught, not explicitly, not clearly, in a language that actually reached the nervous system, how to be in relationship with their own emotions without being governed by them. And here is the thing that most conversations about emotional intelligence miss entirely. The people who handle their emotional lives well are not people who feel less. They are not calmer by nature. They are not built differently. They did not receive some particular gift that others were passed over for. They simply stopped doing certain things. Specific, identifiable things. Behaviors that feel instinctive, that feel like the natural response to what is happening, that feel in the moment like the only available option, and that quietly, consistently keep people emotionally trapped. That is what this is about, not what emotionally intelligent people do, what they no longer do. The first thing is the one almost nobody expects. Emotionally intelligent people do not argue to win. This sounds simple. It is not simple, because the desire to win an argument, to be understood, to be validated, to have the other person finally acknowledge that you were right, is one of the most powerful urges in ordinary human psychology. It does not feel like ego. It feels like justice. It feels like the reasonable request that reality be acknowledged. And the pursuing of it, the explaining and restating and finding new angles and going back to the beginning because surely this time the logic will land. That process feels like communication. It feels like the responsible thing, like you are doing the work of being understood. But here is what is actually happening. The moment an argument shifts from genuine dialogue to the pursuit of winning, the other person has already stopped listening. Not because they are unreasonable, because something in the human brain, when it senses that it is being argued at rather than spoken to, closes. The defenses come up, and every additional point you make, however valid, however clearly expressed, hits those defenses and produces more resistance rather than less. The more you push, the less you reach them. And the person who understands this, who has felt the futility of it enough times to finally believe it, stops pushing. not because they have given up on being understood, because they have understood something more important. Some conversations cannot be won in the moment they are happening, and the attempt to win them costs far more than the victory would ever be worth. Think about a woman who is in a disagreement with someone she loves. She knows she is right. She has the reasoning. She has, in some cases, the evidence. But the conversation has reached that particular point. Most people who argue a lot know exactly the point, where she can see that nothing she says is landing, where his face has gone to the specific place that means this is over, even if the words continue. The old version of her keeps going, finds another angle, rephrase, goes back to the beginning, gets louder, or more precise, or more emotional, or more logical, depending on what seems like it might work. She leaves the conversation having said everything she wanted to say, and having reached nothing. The newer version of her stops at that point. She says, "I don't think we're going to resolve this right now." And she lets it sit, not because she has surrendered, because she has understood that the argument and the truth are two different things, and the truth does not require the argument to be valid. She is still right. She simply no longer needs him to confirm it in this moment. That is not weakness. It is one of the most sophisticated emotional skills available to a human being. Now here is something even more uncomfortable. Emotionally intelligent people do not chase validation. And this one is harder than it sounds, because the need for validation is not vanity. It is not immaturity. It is one of the most fundamental human needs: to be seen, to be understood, to have your experience confirmed by another person who takes it seriously. That need is real and healthy and not something to be overcome. The problem is the chasing. The problem is when that need becomes urgent enough that you begin to make decisions: what to say, how to say it, what to share, how to present yourself, primarily based on what will produce the most affirming response. When you are not speaking your truth, but constructing a version of it that you calculate will be received well. When the internal question before any statement is not, "Is this true?" but "Will they understand? Will they agree? Will they validate me for saying this?" In that state, the actual truth becomes harder and harder to access, because you are not listening to yourself. You are monitoring the audience. A man sits down to write something he genuinely believes. He has thought about it for a long time. It is clear to him, and it feels true. And then, before a word is on the page, he begins to edit in advance, preemptively removing the parts that might generate disagreement, softening the parts that might seem too strong, adding qualifiers to the parts that feel too exposed. By the time he is finished, he has written something that is technically his, but feels like no one's. It is safe. It is broadly acceptable. It produces exactly the kind of muted, non-controversial response that will not embarrass him. And he feels, reading it back, a particular kind of flatness. The flatness of a person who has managed his way out of saying anything real. The emotionally intelligent person, or rather, the person who has learned this particular lesson, makes a different error. They say the real thing. They let it land where it lands. They tolerate the responses they cannot control, not because they don't care what people think, but because they have learned that the alternative, the constant self-editing in service of a reception that never quite satisfies anyway, is a worse trade. The validation you manufacture by making yourself palatable is not the same as the validation that arrives when someone encounters the genuine version of you and chooses it anyway. One feeds the hunger briefly and increases it. The other, when it comes, actually settles something. And here is the contradiction that sits underneath all of this. The need to be understood often creates more misunderstanding, because the attempt to ensure you are understood, the over-explaining, the restating, the circling back, the covering of every angle, signals something to the people around you. It signals that you are not sure you can be understood without extraordinary effort. And that signal produces, in the listener, a subtle but real distance, a slight tilting away from someone who seems to need too much from the interaction. Whereas the person who says the thing clearly and then stops, who trusts that what they have said is sufficient and does not immediately follow it with 3 paragraphs of elaboration, that person is received differently. Even when they are not fully understood, there is a quality of self-possession in the brevity that registers before any content has been processed as something worth listening to. The less you explain, the more clearly you are heard. There is a related pattern worth examining, one that sits just underneath the surface of the validation seeking. Something that looks like sensitivity, but is, on closer inspection, something more complicated. Emotionally intelligent people do not take criticism as identity. Most people, when criticized, experience 2 things simultaneously. The first is the surface-level reaction to the content, the assessment of whether what was said is accurate or fair. The second, and this is the one that does most of the damage, is the deeper, faster, often unconscious interpretation of what the criticism means about who they are. The critique of the work becomes a critique of the worker. The feedback about a behavior becomes a verdict on a character. The specific thing, the concrete and addressable thing, gets converted in the space of a breath into something much larger and much more final. And from inside that larger thing, the criticism becomes impossible to genuinely consider, because you cannot rationally evaluate evidence against yourself when your identity is on trial. Think about a woman who receives feedback on something she has worked hard on. The feedback is specific. It identifies real problems. It is, by any objective measure, useful. And she cannot hear it. Not because she is proud or defensive in a way she would recognize, but because somewhere between the words leaving the other person's mouth and arriving in her mind, they were translated. They passed through a filter, and the filter turned them into something about her fundamental adequacy. So she spends the next 40 minutes managing that, defending herself internally, finding the reasons the feedback was wrong or unfair, or coming from someone who doesn't understand what she was trying to do, not because she is unreasonable, because her identity got caught in it. And the feedback, the useful, specific, actionable feedback, went nowhere. Emotionally intelligent people have, gradually, created a distinction between what they do and who they are. Not a perfect one, not an impermeable one, but enough of one that criticism can land as information rather than as threat. They can ask, is there something true in this? Without the asking itself feeling like a concession of something essential. That distinction, small and quietly maintained and extraordinarily difficult to build, is the difference between someone who learns and grows from feedback and someone who defends against it. And it changes everything about how a person moves through the world. Something else that emotionally intelligent people stop doing. Something that sounds, when you describe it, almost like a superpower, but it's actually just the result of one specific understanding. They do not react immediately, not because they feel nothing, not because they have trained themselves into some form of emotional blankness. The feeling arrives exactly when it would for anyone. The anger, the hurt, the anxiety, the defensiveness, it all shows up on schedule. What does not happen is the immediate translation of that feeling into action. And the reason is this: they have learned through experience, through enough occasions of acting immediately on an emotion and watching the consequences unfold, that a feeling in the moment it arrives is not yet information. It is weather. It is the nervous system's first read on a situation, which is often accurate about the fact that something has happened, but often wildly inaccurate about what it means and what it requires. The person who receives a curt message from their manager and immediately experiences it as a threat to their position. The person who notices their partner is quiet and immediately experiences it as evidence of distance, as the beginning of the end of something. The person who makes a mistake in front of people and immediately experiences it as confirmation of a fundamental inadequacy. All of those first reads are fast and strong and completely wrong. And the person who acts on them immediately, who sends the defensive message, who initiates the anxious conversation, who spirals into self-criticism, is making a permanent response to a temporary state. Emotionally intelligent people have an internal pause. It is not long. Sometimes it is 30 seconds. Sometimes it is sleeping on it. Sometimes it is just the habit of asking, is this how I will feel about this tomorrow? Is this the feeling I want to make a decision from? And more often than not, the answer is no. Think about a man who gets a message that makes his blood pressure change. Something in it, the tone, the implication, the specific word choice, activates something in him that is not proportional to the surface level of what was written. He feels it physically. The tightening, the heat. He starts typing, and then he stops. Not because the feeling isn't real, it is completely real, but because he has done this enough times to know what happens when he sends the message that his nervous system is currently composing. He has seen the conversation that follows. He knows how it ends. He puts the phone down. He does something else. He comes back an hour later. And when he reads the original message again with different eyes, something has shifted. Not completely. He is still bothered. But the version of bothered he is now is workable, is articulable, is something he can bring into an actual conversation rather than fire as a reaction. That pause is not passivity. It is one of the most active choices a person can make. Now, here is the one that most people find genuinely difficult to hear. Emotionally intelligent people do not take responsibility for other people's emotions. This one lands differently depending on who you are. For some people, it is immediately obvious, and they wonder why anyone needed to say it. For others, and this is the majority, though they often don't know it, it lands with the specific discomfort of something that sounds reasonable and feels threatening. Because for a large number of people, taking responsibility for the people around them is not a behavior they chose. It is how love was taught. It is the emotional language of their family of origin. The way you showed you cared was by ensuring that nobody around you was upset, by monitoring the emotional temperature of every room, by adjusting yourself, your mood, your words, your energy, based on what the people around you seemed to need. That habit, learned early and reinforced constantly, is so deeply integrated into how they operate that it does not feel like a choice. It feels like empathy. It feels like caring about people. And there is empathy in it. The sensitivity, the attunement, the ability to read what someone else is experiencing, those are genuinely valuable capacities. The problem is the taking responsibility. The belief that if someone near you is upset, it is either your fault or your job to fix. That their emotional state is something you are responsible for managing. A woman sits with her partner who is in a bad mood. He has not said it is her fault. He has not, in fact, said anything about her at all. He is just in a bad mood. He is tired and irritable and present in the way that tired, irritable people are present. And she cannot relax. She monitors. She adjusts. She tries small things to shift the atmosphere, offers him something, asks careful questions, softens her own energy. And when nothing immediately works, she begins, without having decided to run through what she might have done to cause this, what she could do to resolve it. By the end of the evening, she is exhausted. He is less tired than he was. Nothing dramatic happened, but she took his emotional weather and wore it as her own responsibility. And the wearing of it costs her something she will not fully be able to name. Emotionally intelligent people understand that empathy and self-sacrifice are not the same thing, that you can fully understand what someone is feeling without making their feeling your emergency, that allowing someone to have their emotional experience without rushing to fix it, without absorbing it, without taking it on as evidence of something about you, is not coldness. It is respect. It is the acknowledgement that they are a person capable of managing their own interior world, and that your managing of it for them does not help them. It helps you manage the discomfort of being near someone in discomfort. Understanding someone does not require sacrificing yourself. Read that again. Because many people have spent years believing it does. Here is something quieter. Something that is easy to miss because it does not announce itself. Something that emotionally intelligent people do not do that almost everyone else does constantly. They do not let guilt make their decisions. Guilt is useful. It is the signal that tells you something you have done does not align with your values. It is, in its correct and proportionate form, an important part of having a conscience. But guilt has a second, much less useful form. And this second form is what runs unchecked in the majority of emotionally mature seeming adults. It is guilt as a reflex. Guilt that arrives not because you have done something wrong, but because someone near you is disappointed, because you have said no to something, because you have set a limit, because you have chosen yourself, because you have allowed someone to have a reaction without immediately mobilizing to fix it. That guilt has nothing to do with wrongdoing. It is the nervous system's response to the perceived withdrawal of approval. It is ancient. It is conditioned. It feels moral because guilt always feels moral. But it is not a reliable guide to what is actually right. And the person who lets this second kind of guilt drive their behavior, who says yes when they meant no, who apologizes for things that required no apology, who dismantles perfectly reasonable limits because someone pushed back on them. That person is not being good. They are being managed by a feeling, by a conditioned reflex that knows exactly which buttons to press and has discovered that pressing them produces the desired result. Think about a man who tells a friend he cannot help with something this weekend. He has his reasons. They are genuine, and when he communicates this, his friend's disappointment is real and briefly expressed, and then the conversation ends. And the man spends the rest of the day in the specific discomfort of having said no. He runs the conversation repeatedly. He wonders if he was wrong. He considers sending a follow-up. He drafts a message offering a partial compromise. He feels in a way that has no rational basis given what actually happened, like he has done something that needs to be repaired. Nothing needs to be repaired. His friend was briefly disappointed and then continued with their life. The guilt is not information. It is noise. And the emotionally intelligent person has learned slowly, through discomfort, through enough occasions of acting on guilt that wasn't warranted and watching how it compounds, to hear that noise without obeying it. This is harder than it sounds, because guilt noise and guilt signal feel almost identical from inside. The body does not distinguish between them clearly. They both arrive with the same urgency, the same quality of something needing to be addressed. The distinction is in the question, did I actually do something wrong? Not did someone have a reaction? Did I actually do something that violated my own values? If the answer is yes, the guilt is signal. Listen to it. If the answer is no, the guilt is noise. And acting on it will not quiet it. It will teach it that it can produce results, and it will become louder. There is one more thing, the deepest one, the one underneath all of the others. Emotionally intelligent people do not abandon themselves. This one is harder to describe because self-abandonment is not always visible. It does not always look like collapse or crisis. It often looks like being extremely accommodating, like being easy to get along with, like being the kind of person who never makes things difficult. Self-abandonment is the pattern that produces all the other patterns. It is what happens when a person has learned, usually early, usually through environments where their needs were inconvenient, or their feelings were too much, or their authentic self produced negative consequences, to manage their own experience into whatever shape is most acceptable to the people around them. Not once. As a way of living. The managing of the reaction that might be too strong, the suppressing of the opinion that might be unwelcome, the performance of an emotional state that is more palatable than the actual one, the systematic prioritizing of everyone else's comfort over honest contact with your own inner life. This looks from the outside like being a good person, a giving person, a stable person, someone who doesn't make things about themselves. From the inside, it eventually produces a very specific kind of quiet suffering. Not always dramatic, not always nameable, just the persistent sense of being slightly disconnected from your own experience, of going through days that are fine by external measure and feeling, underneath the fineness, a flatness that sleep doesn't fix. It produces the loneliness of being surrounded by people who like a version of you that is not entirely real. And here is the uncomfortable thing about recognizing this. You cannot fix it by deciding to be more authentic. Authenticity is not a decision. It is what is left when you stop performing. And stopping the performance, when the performance has been the primary survival strategy for decades, is not an act of will. It is a slow and ongoing process of choosing yourself in small moments, of noticing when you are about to adjust your reaction for someone else, and pausing, of saying the honest thing once, and surviving the reaction, and using that survival as evidence. Emotionally intelligent people are not the ones who never lose themselves. They are the ones who notice sooner when they are starting to, and who return, without drama, without excessive self-criticism, to themselves. They have not solved the problem. They have simply reduced the amount of time they spend away from their own center, and alongside that, running quietly underneath everything else described here, is something that took most of them a long time to see. They stopped confusing peace with distance. Because for many people who begin to do this work, who begin setting limits, pausing before reacting, refusing to absorb everyone's emotional weather, there comes a point where it starts to feel like becoming colder, less available, less caring. And that feeling is important to name, because it is one of the most common reasons people reverse course. They make a change, they hold a limit, they allow someone to have a feeling without immediately mobilizing to fix it. And then the anxiety arrives, the voice that says, "You are becoming someone who doesn't care. You are building walls. This is not growth. This is selfishness wearing the costume of growth." And they go back. They soften the limit. They apologize for the boundary. They return to the old patterns because the old patterns at least felt like love. But here is what is true. The calmest people are not emotionless. They simply stopped obeying every emotion. And the people with the clearest limits are not cold. They are, in many cases, the warmest people in the room, because they can actually be present, because they are not spending their entire emotional energy managing other people's experience. They have something left to give when giving is genuine, because when they say yes, they mean it, and because the version of them that shows up in a relationship is not performing, it is actually there. The person who has never learned to limit themselves is not more loving. They are more exhausted. And exhausted people cannot give what they have not kept any of. Think about someone who has spent years giving everything away, every emotional resource available to them deployed in service of everyone else's needs. Every yes that cost something, and every no that never came, and every moment of their own experience that was set aside because someone nearby needed attention. They are kind. They are generous. By every measure, they are a giving person, and they are running on empty. And the giving, which was once something they chose, has become something they can no longer stop. Not a preference, a compulsion, a way of preventing the anxiety that arrives when they stop. That is not love. That is depletion wearing the costume of love. The person who has learned to keep something for themselves, who has said no when no was true, who has let someone else manage their own discomfort, who has arrived in a relationship with something still intact. That person gives differently, more present, more real, more genuinely there. Limits are not the walls between people. They are what make genuine contact possible. And here is perhaps the most important thing to say at the end of all of this. The behaviors described here, the arguing to win, the chasing of validation, the immediate reaction, the absorbing of other people's emotions, the guilt-driven decisions, the self-abandonment, these are not personal failures. They are not evidence of something wrong with the people who do them. They are the predictable outcomes of emotional educations that most people never received, of environments that taught the wrong lessons with the best available intentions, of nervous systems that adapted to conditions that have since changed, but whose adaptations are still running. The person who over-explains is not weak. They were taught that their choices required defense. The person who absorbs everyone's emotions is not codependent in some shameful way. They were trained to equate monitoring with love. The person who cannot sit with guilt is not immature. They learned that the discomfort of having disappointed someone was something they were responsible for resolving. These are learned behaviors, not permanent conditions. And the emotionally intelligent people who no longer do these things did not stop because they were naturally more evolved. They stopped because at some point, through enough pain, enough insight, enough quiet accumulation of experience, they learned to pause before the automatic response. To ask, is this the version of me I want to act from right now? Is this the feeling that should be making this decision? Not always, not perfectly, not without regression, but enough. Enough to change the ratio. Enough to stop losing so much ground to the patterns. Enough to be, more of the time, in relationship with themselves. And that, in the end, is what emotional intelligence actually is. Not the absence of difficult feelings, not the performance of composure, not a state you arrive at and remain in permanently. It is the slowly developed capacity to be present to your own experience without being run by it, to feel what is real and choose what to do with it, to know the difference between the emotion and the truth, between the temporary state and the permanent decision, between the noise and the signal. In the quiet, ongoing, often unremarkable practice of making that distinction, one moment at a time.